Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been talking about a dirty bomb. What is he talking about, and why is the West so skeptical of what he's up to?
So earlier this week, Russian President Vladimir Putin and a number of Russian defense officials launched allegations that Ukraine was planning to launch a dirty bomb. A dirty bomb is similar to a normal bomb, but includes toxins or chemicals that can travel to expand the radius or the damage that a bomb would cause. And so it's not quite a nuclear weapon, but it is a significant upgrade in the level of destruction that we would see in the war. And so we heard earlier this week from Russians that Ukraine was planning to do this. Western leaders very quickly denounced this as false. Ukraine denounced it as false. It was, no one from the West really gave it any credence. That being said, it did concern Western leaders because Russia has a propensity to accuse its antagonists or its opposition of doing exactly what they're planning on doing.
Right.
So it raised concerns from Western officials that Russia is planning to use a dirty bomb. Now we know from defense officials who have said, as recently as today, that they don't believe that's going to happen, but it was concerning to hear. Defense officials haven't seen any change in Russia's nuclear posture, but are, very aware of it. They're monitoring it daily, and they are, they've been very clear. Not just defense officials, but the entire administration has been very clear about the possible consequences that could, come from a Russian tactical nuclear strike or a dirty bomb.
As you said, a big part of Russia's strategy, at least in terms of public relations and maybe propaganda, has been sort of false flag operations.
Absolutely.
To say that Ukraine is doing various things that maybe they're doing themselves, and this is all against the backdrop of a lot of talk about whether Russia might use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine.
Exactly. And so when we look at what's happening on the ground, Ukraine has, over the course of the fall, really taken back pretty substantial amounts of ground. The outlook on the war has changed. Russia's hand has gotten worse. Vladimir Putin appears to be more desperate.
Right.
We saw in the fall him call up a significant amount of reserve forces, and we haven't seen them make much of a difference in terms of success on the battlefield. We saw them try to annex territory, and they're barely holding on to that territory, and no one is recognizing that annexation. So as Russia's hand continues to get worse, it raises concerns that they will run out of options and ultimately resort to using a tactical nuclear weapon. And we've heard, every official in the U.S. and the NATO countries express significant concern and demonstrate the severity of what that would mean for the war and what a response could be.
Right. So the United States National Defense Strategy has been released. It hasn't really listed Russia as the biggest threat. Let's talk a little bit about what's in there. What is the Biden administration sort of focusing on as part of its overarching strategy?
So it's an important point that you mentioned, and it's important to look back at the most recent National Defense Strategy, which came out in 2018. And so in 2018, it essentially put Russia and China as the U.S. Two biggest concerns, but essentially put them on an equal playing field. Come 2022, in this year's National Defense Strategy, the Biden administration really put ahead the belief that China is the pacing challenge, is what they call them.
Right.
Now, they still believe Russia is an acute threat, which is how they describe it,
right.
But they say China is the only country who has both the means and the ambition to really disturb and harm U.S. interest abroad. And so when we take that into consideration in the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, it really does bring the issue of Taiwan to the front and center. And so we've seen both with Chinese President Xi Jinping getting a new term and strongly calling for the reunification, setting up a possible scenario where U.S. Could have to intervene in a Chinese takeover.
Because there does seem to be a little bit of a deterioration of that whole situation, even just since House Speaker Nancy Pelosi went to visit Taiwan, and the Chinese really reacted badly to that.
Absolutely. So both before Speaker Pelosi's trip and since then, we've heard from U.S. officials that China has really tried to rewrite what the status quo looks like between themselves, Taiwan, and the United States. And now the United States philosophy, and it's been repeated a lot over the last couple months, is that they recognize that Taiwan wants to be independent. They recognize that China believes Taiwan is a part of it, but they are not in favor of any unilateral motion from either side. And so they really are hoping that China won't, militarily try to take over Taiwan.
Right.
But we are hearing concerns from even defense officials that it's more that the aggressive nature of their actions indicates more likely that they could.
Right. It seems to just be a lot of saber rattling.
Yeah.
So one area where President Biden's enjoyed a great deal of bipartisan support is on his policy toward Ukraine. There have been some Republican defectors on it, but still mostly Republican leadership has been supporting him. But Democrats have up to this point been unanimous in supporting the various aid packages and drawdown packages and what Biden has been trying to do in terms of sanctions. But some fissures briefly appeared in Democratic support for the Biden approach to Ukraine, but was very quickly walked back. What did we hear from the Congressional Progressive Caucus?
So, as you mentioned earlier this week, the Congressional Progressive Caucus released a letter signed by 30 of its members, and the letter, reiterated its support for President Biden and what he's doing for Ukraine, but emphasized or called for President Biden to re-emphasize diplomacy in terms of a way of ending the war, given that we are, some would say, on the cusp of a nuclear weapon being used, or the closest cusp we've gotten to that in a long time. And so it was a little surprising that the Democrats or the progressives would come out with this letter, given the nature of the war and the threats from President Putin. But we found out quickly after the letter was released from members that signed it that they had signed it earlier in the summer. We heard from members who said they signed it in late June and July, and some who said they wouldn't sign it today. And a big part of that is the war has changed since June and July when these members signed it. Russia has continued their aggression, gone further. The war has escalated. The tension and the likelihood of a nuclear weapon being used has risen since then. And so the letter was quickly walked back. Representative Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, who introduced the letter, withdrew it quickly, and she blamed it on staff. But we did even see a couple members here and there who said they still support the letter. So even though it was withdrawn and there were people who said they wouldn't sign it anymore, there were a handful who still believe that diplomacy is the way out.
There also did seem to be a little bit of an element of House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy had talked about there not being a blank check for Ukraine if Republicans recapture their congressional majorities. Maybe there were some people in the Congressional Progressive Caucus who didn't want to seem to be associated with that.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy's comments really did raise eyebrows, given the election is 2 weeks away. And so he even walked it back a little bit, saying he does support Ukraine and wants the U.S. to help Ukraine defeat Russia. But his focus was on that phrase, blank check, and said he thinks the U.S. should really be, mindful in how they're providing this aid. And we heard from Representative Mike Turner, who is on the House Intelligence Committee, say that in his opinion, his party isn't calling for aid to end, but that he's calling for it to be, much more direct. He doesn't want it to be a part of additional or larger spending packages. He thinks it should be very focused.
And so finally, there's another letter that was circulated on Capitol Hill. The Pentagon has had its response to the Supreme Court reversing Roe versus Wade, implementing new policies for the benefit of service members. There are some Republicans in the House who are not very happy with that policy.
Yeah, so about 40 Republicans signed on to a letter led by Congressman Chip Roy, expressing their disappointment with the Pentagon's plan to provide travel expenses for service members or family members of service members who have to travel, long distances to get reproductive care, specifically abortions. And so, this letter isn't, a surprise. We heard as soon as this policy was announced, pushback from Republicans. The real question is, what can they do about it if they went back to the House in 2 weeks?
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.